The snow had been falling for 2 days when Brett Thornton stopped counting the hours and started counting the cattle. She could hear them before she could see them, their low, unsteady sounds carrying through the barn wall into the dark of the house. 40 head pressed together in the low barn she and Clem had built against the south-facing creek bank because Clem had said it would hold heat, if anything on this property would hold heat. The blizzard had sealed the door overnight. She had to kick it open with both boots at first light on the second morning, the cold so sharp it felt like breathing through a tin pipe. And she had stood there in the gray-white half-dark and counted them by shape, through the lantern's small pale circle. Because if she lost the herd, she lost everything, and Haskell Pruitt would be standing on her front steps before the snow had finished melting. She counted 39. 40 cattle had walked into that barn at dusk 2 days prior, before the storm sealed the valley. She counted again, moving the lantern slow. 39. She found the calf near the back wall, pressed flat on its side. She knew before she touched it. 1 head. She had started the winter with 40 and she was already down to 39. She stayed there on her knees in the manure-dark straw for a moment. And then she stood up, and she went back to the house for the feed she had stacked along the east wall before the storm, and she carried it out in armloads until her arms stopped working properly, and she kept carrying it anyway. The story of why Brett Thornton was alone in a Montana Territory blizzard, fighting for 39 cattle on 320 acres, that 3 separate men were trying to take from her began 5 months earlier, in the first week of April 1883, with the sound of Clem coughing through the bedroom wall. Clem Thornton had ranched that land since 1877. He had broken the first ground on the creek bottom by himself with a single turning plow and a borrowed mule, and he had built the low barn before he built the house, because that was the order a rancher put things in. He had 40 head of cattle and a feed debt of roughly $190 owed to a supplier in Miles City, and he had a small sodden timber house with glass windows he had hauled in from the rail stop at great trouble and expense, because Brett had said glass windows were the one thing she would not go without. Brett had married him in Kansas in 1879 and had come west with him without complaint, and she had learned the land the same way Clem had, from the ground up, season by season, until she could read a September sky or a creek's color in runoff as well as he could. She also had Dora, her brother's girl, orphaned when Dora was 11 and now 13, and living in the small back room with a collection of river stones arranged on the windowsill that she added to every time she walked the creek. When the lung sickness took hold of Clem that winter, it took hold quietly, the way a cold holds quietly for weeks before a person realizes it has moved somewhere it should not have moved. By March, he could not cross the yard without stopping. By the 1st of April, he was in the bed and staying there. By the 9th of April, on a gray morning with the creek running high from the snowmelt and the first meadowlarks calling from the willow scrub, Clem Thornton died in his own bed, with Brett's hand in his, and Dora sitting in the doorway watching the floor. The valley knew within a week. A rancher named George Aldridge rode over from his place 2 miles east on the 5th day, ostensibly to offer condolences, and sat at Brett's kitchen table drinking her coffee and advising her in a careful voice that she ought to consider her position. He had a buyer in mind, he said. A good buyer. Someone who would pay fair for the acreage before the land came up. Contested, and she really did need to consider her position. A woman alone on 320 acres with a feed debt and a child to see to, he said. Not an accusation, just the plain facts as he saw them. Brett poured him more coffee. She said, George, I know where the south fence line runs, and I know what the deed says. And the deed says it says what it says. George looked at his hands. He rode home shortly after. 3 weeks later, on a morning in early May when Brett was mending the south fence herself, She looked up to see two men she did not know riding along the property boundary from the direction of the creek. They stopped their horses 20 yards from her, and one of them, a man in a wool coat who introduced himself as Earl Vetch, told her that he and his partner had filed a claim on the South 40 acres under a new survey ordered by the General Land Office, and that if she had questions about it, she was welcome to ride to the land office in Miles City, where the paperwork was on file. Brett stayed where she was, the fence stretcher still in her hands. "Which survey office?" she said. Vetch said a name she did not recognize as any office she knew had authority in that district. His partner said nothing. Brett looked at them both for a moment. "You can ride back the way you came," she said. They didn't ride back the way they came, not that day. They camped on the ridge above the creek bottom for a week, where she could see their fire at night from the kitchen window, and then they put up a rough claim stake on the southeast corner of what was unambiguously her land. About 30 yards inside the property boundary, Clem had surveyed and recorded in 1877. Haskell Pruitt arrived the last week of May. If Earl Vetch was a nuisance, Pruitt was a calculation. He came alone, on a good horse, wearing a coat that had been bought in a city and had not suffered enough weather to look like it belonged in Montana territory. He was a land speculator out of Billings who had already filed on 3 other disputed properties that year, and he had a copy of the same doubtful survey under his arm when he knocked at Brett's front door like a man calling on a neighbor. Brett opened the door and did not invite him in. Pruitt introduced himself pleasantly. He said he had heard about her loss and was sorry for it. He said he understood she was managing alone and that the summer season was pressing and the feed debt was outstanding. And he said he had a fair offer to make, fair being a word he used 3 times in the first 2 minutes, which, in Brett's experience, meant the offer was not going to be fair at all. He offered her $600 for the 320 acres and said she could keep a small portion of the livestock. Brett said, "My land is not for sale." Pruitt smiled the way men smiled when they had already decided what was going to happen. "Mrs. Thornton," he said, "you cannot run this place alone. You know that." "I know what the deed says," Brett said, "and I know what that survey is." She closed the door. What Pruitt did not know, and what the valley did not know, was that Brett had already written to the county land office in Miles City the week after Clem died, asking for a full transcript of the original deed survey and a copy of the GLO plat, filed in 1877. She had done this before George Aldridge ever came to her kitchen, before Vetch set his stake, before Pruitt knocked on her door, because Clem had told her once, in that quiet way he explained the practical things, that if anything happened to him, the deed was the first document she needed to know by memory. The copy arrived the 2nd week of June. She read it 3 times, sitting at the kitchen table with Dora across from her eating bread and watching her read, and then she put it in a tin box that she kept under the floorboard beneath the kitchen table, and she went back to work. The summer of 1883 was the kind of summer that tests every calculation a rancher makes going into it. The grass came in thin from the cold spring, and the creek ran lower than usual by July, and the cattle needed moving between pastures twice as often as they had the summer before. Brett did most of this on horseback, with Dora managing the near pasture gate and learning which animals were which by the shape of their backs and the way they moved, because Brett had decided early in the summer that Dora was going to learn everything, all of it, because no one else was going to be there to learn it with her. Through July and into August, Brett sold 7 head at the Miles City stock pens at prices that were not good, but were sufficient. She paid $60 of the feed debt on the 1st of August and another $80 on the 1st of September, and she rode to Miles City both times herself, which meant Dora was alone at the homestead for the better part of a day each time. a fact that didn't sit comfortably with Brett, but which she managed by leaving Dora with the rifle propped beside the kitchen door and instructions to fire once into the air if anyone rode into the yard uninvited. Dora was never required to fire it. Vetch and his partner were gone by late August. Vetch's camp on the ridge had grown quieter through July, and one morning Brett rode past and the camp was simply empty. The fire pit cold and grown over with grass at the edges, the claim stake still in the ground. She pulled the stake herself and dropped it in the creek. That left Pruitt, who wasn't a man who camped on ridges. Pruitt had taken a room in a small hotel in the nearest town, 12 miles east, and he came around the property twice in June and once in July, always on the road that ran along the north boundary, always studying the homestead from a distance with the look of a man who was making arithmetic in his head. He stopped coming in person after July, but he left word with the hotel keeper that his offer to Brett stood and that it would not stand indefinitely, which the hotel keeper passed along to anyone who asked, and several people who did not. The third man, a homesteader named Carson, who had filed a claim on the northwest 40 acres under yet another version of the same disputed survey, built an actual fence on the property line in September. Not on Brett's land. On the property line itself, which was technically legal and technically infuriating, because the fence cut off her access to the northwest water source she had been using for 6 years. Brett rode to see Sheriff Aldous Cole in Miles City the day she found the fence. Cole was a deliberate man who said little and wrote a great deal in a small notebook he kept in his coat pocket. He listened to Brett explain the fence and the survey and the original deed, and he looked at her over the top of the notebook with an expression that was not unsympathetic. And he said that the survey question would need to go through the land office, and that he could not remove a fence from a property line without a legal determination. But that if she had the original deed and the GLO plat, she had a solid basis for filing a formal contest. "I know," Brett said. "I'm filing it now." Cole looked at her. "I sent the paperwork in August," she said. "I'm here to ask how long it takes." Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Come back in the spring." She rode the 12 miles home in the dark. Carson's fence stood through September and into October. Brett worked around it, moving the northwest cattle to the creek bottom pasture instead, and adjusting the feeding rotation accordingly, which cost her more labor per day than she could well afford in a month when there was hay to cut. The hay was the most pressing thing. The valley had told her in June, with the particular patience of people stating obvious facts, that she would not get the hay in alone before frost, and that without the hay in, the herd would not carry through winter, and without the herd, there was no ranch. She cut the first field the third week of September with a scythe. She sharpened herself every 2 days, working from first light until the dew came back in the evening. Dora raked behind her with a hand rake, steady and without complaint, moving in the same direction Brett moved, learning the rhythm of it. A neighbor named Powell, who had a place 4 miles west and had stayed carefully neutral through the summer, rode past one morning and stopped his horse on the road to watch them. Powell said nothing for a long moment. Then he called out, "You'll want to stack closer to the barn before November." Brett did not look up from the scythe. "I know where the barn is," she said. Powell rode on. She cut hay for 3 weeks. She stacked it in 2 rows along the barn wall, close enough that she could pitch it directly through the barn's side window, because Clem had taught her to build for the worst day rather than the average day. And the worst day was a blizzard in January when she needed to feed without going far from the house. By the middle of October, she had enough hay to carry 40 head through a hard winter, if the winter was not harder than the hay. The feed debt was paid in full on the 22nd of October. $50 of it from the last cattle sale, and the balance from the small savings Clem had kept in a tin on the bedroom shelf. Brett had not told anyone she was paying it. She had not discussed it with the Miles City supplier, beyond what the transaction required. The supplier wrote out a receipt, which she folded and put in the tin box with the deed. The pivot came in late October. George Aldridge rode over again. He sat at the kitchen table again. This time he said that Pruitt's offer had apparently been raised, that the word from the hotel was $750 now, and that before the winter set in was the time to consider it, not after. He said it in the voice of a man who had decided he was doing her a kindness. Dora was in the back room. Brett could hear her moving quietly on the other side of the thin wall. Brett put her hands flat on the table and looked at George Aldridge. She did not say anything. The silence was long enough to be uncomfortable. George said, "Brett, you've had a hard year. There is no shame in taking a fair price." Brett looked at the window at the yellow-gray afternoon sky above the bare willows along the creek. She thought about the hay stacked along the barn wall. She thought about the tin box under the floor. "Go home, George," she said. He went. The blizzard came on the 23rd of November. It came from the north without much warning, the way the worst ones came in Montana Territory. A pale greenish tinge to the sky in the afternoon, and then the temperature dropping 30 degrees in 4 hours and the first hard snow by dark. Brett had been watching the sky since noon, and by the time the temperature fell, she had already moved the cattle into the low barn. The 40 head crowded into the space that was tight for 30, but manageable, the body heat of the animals doing what the building alone could not. Dora filled the water barrel before the pump handle froze. Brett brought in 3 days of firewood before the door became difficult to open, stacking it inside the back wall of the house in a pile that left Dora barely enough room to pass to the kitchen. The tin box was in Brett's coat pocket. She had put it there when the sky turned green, without particularly thinking about why, and she kept it there through the first night. The first day of the storm was wind and cold, a whiteout that made the 50-yard walk to the barn a navigation problem rather than a walk. Brett ran a rope from the back door to the barn door, Clem's old trick from the winter of 1881, and she went to the barn 4 times that first day to feed and check the water trough, holding the rope the whole way, the wind flat and hard against her left side, the kind of wind that made it difficult to understand which direction was forward. The second day was colder, 15 below by Brett's reading of the thermometer nailed to the barn wall, and the wind still running. The herd was restless, the cattle pressing against each other and turning in the confined space, and Brett spent 2 hours in the barn on the second afternoon, just working among them, moving from side to side, running her hand along their backs because a frightened herd pushed into a corner could injure itself, and she had seen it happen. She found the calf on the morning of the 3rd day. She had been down to 39 head now, 1 lost to the cold in the night, and she carried that number in her chest for the rest of the morning, the way a person carries a bruise they cannot stop pressing on. 39. The herd at the start of the summer had been 40. She had sold 7 through the summer and bought them back in her calculations by the time the cattle came back to full weight in the fall. She was running the numbers in her head against the coming spring, and the hay she had left, and what she owed no one now, the debt paid, and what she might sell in the spring, and the 39 cattle had to be enough. The blizzard broke on the afternoon of the 3rd day. The wind died first, and then the sky lightened from gray to a pale flat white, and then for the first time in 3 days, Brett could see the creek from the kitchen window. The willows bent and heavily loaded, the snow on the ground so deep it erased the lower fence rails and made the barn look as if it had grown up from the earth rather than being built on it. She let the cattle out of the barn one at a time, counting them into the near pasture in the thin, cold light. 39. The next morning, she rode to Miles City. The land office contest she had filed in August had been reviewed. She knew this from a letter that had arrived in October, brief and official, telling her the formal hearing was scheduled for February, but that if she appeared in person with the original deed before that date, a summary determination could sometimes be made faster. She appeared in person on the last day of November, still stiff in the shoulders from the blizzard work, with the tin box in her coat and Dora left behind at the homestead, with the same instructions she always left. The land office clerk was a young man named Peters, who had the look of someone who had been told more than once to be careful about widows and their claims. He took her deed and the original GLO plat and the transcript of the 1877 survey and laid them out on his desk with the careful attention of a man who already suspected what they were going to show him. The disputed survey Pruitt had filed, along with the versions Vetch and Carson had used, all three derived from a remeasurement done in 1882 by a private contractor working for a Billings land concern, a concern that Peters, to his credit, appeared already to know something about. The 1877 survey was a general land office survey. The 1882 remeasurement had no official standing. Peters looked at the documents for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "Mrs. Thornton, the deed is sound." Brett said, "I know." She rode home. She stopped at the sheriff's office on her way through town, and she left Peters's written statement with Cole along with a formal request for removal of any encroachments on the property described in the deed, specifically the northwest fence and any continuing presence by Haskell Pruitt, who was not on a boundary line but had been riding her land in October, which she also mentioned. Cole wrote in his notebook for a while. Then he said, "Give me 2 weeks. If you have followed this story to here, you might find yourself asking what kind of woman holds a deed box in her coat pocket through 3 days of a blizzard rather than let it sit in the house. Leave a comment below and tell us what this story brought to mind. Stories like this one are why this channel exists." Cole came in 1 week. He rode out to Pruitt's hotel with a deputy and a written removal order signed by the Territorial Land Office and told Pruitt that his survey was legally void, his claim was legally void, and that if he was observed on or in proximity to the Thornton property again, the matter would proceed past removal and into criminal trespass. Pruitt, by several accounts, was not gracious about it. He said things about the land office and about the territorial court system and about the general unreasonableness of the situation that no one found persuasive. He checked out of the hotel 2 days later and was not seen in that part of the territory again. Carson's fence came down the same week. Cole's deputy pulled the posts himself. Brett received a letter from the land office in early December, confirming that all 3 contested claims had been formally voided and that the deed to 320 acres in her name was the sole valid claim of record. She read the letter at the kitchen table with Dora sitting across from her, and she folded it and put it in the tin box and put the tin box back under the floor. Dora said, "Is it done?" Brett looked at her for a moment, at this girl who had watched everything from the near distance without complaint, who had raked hay and stood at gates and carried water in a blizzard and asked very few questions and noticed everything. "It is," Brett said. The winter passed. It was a hard winter, but an ordinary hard winter, which meant that if you had the hay in and the herd in and the wood stacked, you endured it and came out the other side. Brett endured it and came out the other side with 39 cattle and no debt and 320 acres that belonged to her without contest. In the spring of 1884, she drove cattle on grass that was hers and had been hers and was going to remain hers. And she did so without mentioning to George Aldridge or anyone else in the valley that she had done what they said she could not do. The valley knew. People knew without being told. And some of them found reasons to ride past the homestead that spring and acknowledge her with a nod from the road, which was the currency of recognition in that country. No words, just a nod. Powell stopped his horse on the road one morning in April and watched her for a moment, the same way he had watched her cut hay in September. He said, "Good grass this year." Brett said, "It is." He rode on. The feed debt had been gone since October, a fact she had told no one and which no one seemed to think to ask about, perhaps because they had already moved on to the next assumption about what she would or would not manage. She found she did not mind. The receipt was in the tin box. The tin box was under the floor. That was sufficient. There is a kind of patience that is not the same thing as waiting. Brett Thornton had it. It was the patience of someone who had decided what the work required and done the work, and who understood that the work was the answer to every question anyone else thought to ask. She bought 4 replacement calves in May 1884 and rebuilt to 40 head by summer. She fenced the northwest water access properly in June with cedar posts she cut herself from the timber on the North Ridge and wire she ordered from Miles City, and she paid for the wire in full when she picked it up. The south fence she had been mending when Vetch and his partner first rode past got its last new post the same month. Dora was 14 that summer, tall and brown-armed and increasingly difficult to surprise, which Brett had come to regard as one of the more useful qualities a person in that country could have. She could read the cattle now nearly as well as Brett could, and she had learned to read the weather from the grass and the creek color, the way Clem had taught Brett to read it, which meant Brett had passed something forward without intending to, and was quietly glad she had. The years moved in the way that years move in country where the work is consistent and the land is stubborn and the seasons always come whether you are ready for them or not. Brett planted a kitchen garden in 1885 and expanded it in 1886 and took a small pride in the tomatoes, which were unreliable but possible if the summer held long enough, which it did more years than not. She added a better root cellar in 1887, dug by a man from town whom she paid fair and who did the job well, and she extended the low barn by 12 feet in 1888 because the herd had grown to 55 head, and the original structure was no longer adequate. She did not remarry. This was not a statement and not a wound, simply a fact about how she was built. The same way some horses will only stand for one person's hands and make no apology about it. Dora married in 1893, a rancher named Hollis from the next county who was steady and careful, and who had the good sense to understand that the place Dora was marrying into was as much hers as Brett's, and that the understanding between the two women who had kept the homestead through everything it had been through was not a thing he was going to be able to renegotiate. He seemed to accept this without difficulty, which was all Brett required of him. After Dora married, she did not leave. This was not in any agreement Brett had made, not spoken or written, but Dora had never been a person who left things she had decided to keep, and she had decided long ago, somewhere in the fall of 1883 between the hay raking and the blizzard, that this land was hers the same way it was Brett's, and she was not going to walk away from it any more than Brett had. They ran the ranch together through the 90s, the two of them and Hollis, with 2 children born to Dora and Hollis in 1895 and 1898, who grew up on the property the way Dora had, learning it from the ground up in all seasons and weather. Brett taught them the cattle the same way she had taught Dora, and she taught them the deed and what it said, and why it mattered, because she had come to believe that knowing what a document said was not a legal education, but a survival skill, the same category as reading the sky or knowing where the creek ran low in August, The county had grown around the valley in the 90s. More homesteaders, more fences, more roads, a school 6 miles east, and then a better one 4 miles east, a new general store, a telegraph line by 1891 that made Miles City feel closer than it had in 1883, and yet did not change much of what the work actually required. Brett watched the growth the way she watched the weather, with attention but without anxiety, making adjustments when adjustments were warranted and holding steady when steady was the right response. She was known in the county by the end of the century as the woman who had held the Thornton place through the land troubles of 1883, which was how the valley now referred to a period that, at the time, had felt rather more immediate than a name could carry. The story had simplified itself in the retelling, the way all true stories do when enough years have passed to sand the rough edges smooth. What the valley remembered was that 3 men had tried to take her land, and she had not let them. And that was accurate as far as it went, though it left out the hay and the blizzard and the tin box and the 39 cattle, and everything else that had actually constituted the holding. She did not correct the simplification. It was not her business to correct it. Haskell Pruitt's land concern in Billings collapsed in 1887, caught in a dispute over 3 separate fraudulent surveys that had finally attracted the attention of the federal land office. Brett read about it in a Miles City newspaper that came through the county by mail and noted the fact without particular satisfaction. Pruitt had not been a monster. He had been a man with a calculation and without much imagination about what a person who was not him might be capable of, and the frontier had eventually made the same assessment of him that it made of everyone who bet against the land rather than with it. By 1905, Brett was 61 years old and had been running the same 320 acres for 28 years, the last 22 of them without Clem, and the last 12 of them with Dora and Hollis as her working partners. The herd stood at 62 head. She had fenced every acre properly, rebuilt the house twice in sections, added a second water trough on the north side, and replaced the original barn entirely in 1901, with a structure that was larger and sounder and built to hold heat the same way the first one had, because Clem had been right about that principle, and being right about a principle was worth honoring. Her hands by then were the hands that told the story more than her face did, stiff in the cold mornings, scarred across the left palm from a wire incident in 1896, brown and hard and exact in their work, the hands of someone who had never asked the land to be something it was not, and had never asked herself to be something she was not, either. She slowed in the last years, which was the right word. Slowed, not stopped. She stopped cutting hay personally in 1907 and left that to Hollis and the 2 children, though she inspected the stacking every time and had opinions about it that she expressed plainly. She stopped the long horseback rides in 1909 and limited herself to the near pasture, though she knew every animal in the herd still and could read the condition of the grass from the kitchen window with enough accuracy to know when it was time to move them. She died in the autumn of 1911, the 28th year she had held the land alone, on a morning in late September when the creek was running clear, and the willows were going yellow at the tips, and the cattle were in the south pasture, making the low, steady sounds that meant nothing was wrong. Dora buried her on the hill above the creek, on the south-facing slope where you could see the whole valley below and the mountains blue-gray in the distance. In the ground she had defended through that long first year, and every year after. The marker was plain and said what it needed to say. The land passed to Dora entire, 320 acres, with a herd of 62 head, and a small root cellar stocked for winter, and a tin box under the kitchen floor that Dora did not find until she was moving the furniture to lay new boards in the spring of 1912. Inside was the fee debt receipt from October 1883. the transcript of the 1877 survey, the land office letter from December 1883, and Clem's original deed written out in a surveyor's careful hand on paper that had gone soft at the folds from years of being opened and refolded. Dora took the tin box and the papers out to the hill and sat in the grass beside Brett's marker for a while. The valley spread below her and the cattle visible as dark moving shapes in the pasture. And then she brought the box back to the house and put it on the kitchen shelf where she could see it from the table. It stayed there. The woman the valley remembered as the one who simply did not leave had done something rather more specific than that, and Dora knew what it was. And the land under her feet was the evidence, 320 acres that had been held by the particular combination of a good deed kept and a hard winter endured, and 39 cattle brought through a 3-day blizzard by a woman who counted them every time she walked into the barn, not because she was afraid, but because she believed that what you counted, you kept. What does a story like Brett's bring up for you? Leave a comment below, and if this is the kind of story you come back for, there are more here on this channel, the quiet ones, the ones where the land is the witness and the work is the testimony. And the best answer to a man who says you cannot is simply to do it.